The autumn breeze rustled through the tree-lined streets of Cedar Grove, a suburban neighborhood where perfect lawns and white picket fences painted a picture of tranquility. Officer James Wilson sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel, his mind clouded by personal frustrations and a string of recent burglaries in the area. His 15 years on the force had left him jaded, seeing threats where sometimes there were none. A sleek black Mercedes caught his attention as it rolled through a stop sign, barely pausing. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and pursued the vehicle. The car pulled over smoothly into a nearby parking lot, its tinted windows revealing nothing about the driver inside. Officer Wilson approached with his usual stern demeanor, flashlight in hand despite the afternoon sun. The window rolled down to reveal a well-dressed black woman in her mid-30s, her professional attire and calm demeanor at odds with Wilson's preconceptions. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone unnecessarily harsh. The woman reached for her purse with deliberate movements, maintaining eye contact through the rearview mirror. "I apologize for the rolling stop, officer," she said, her voice steady and educated. "I was just heading home from a meeting." Wilson barely acknowledged her words, snatching the documents from her outstretched hand. Something about her composure irritated him, it didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed in his mind. As he ran her information through the system, his radio crackled with reports of a nearby disturbance. Instead of clearing her with a warning, Wilson made a decision that would change both their lives. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand resting on his holster. The woman's expression shifted from surprise to controlled anger. "On what grounds, officer?" she asked, her phone now recording the interaction. Wilson's response was to open her door himself, his actions becoming increasingly aggressive. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." His voice carried the weight of authority he'd grown too comfortable wielding. The woman complied, her movements precise and dignified, even as Wilson roughly guided her toward his patrol car. "You're making a serious mistake," she warned, her voice remaining remarkably composed. Wilson ignored her, reciting Miranda rights with mechanical efficiency. As he reached for his handcuffs, a familiar voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Wilson. What the hell are you doing?" The commanding tone belonged to Captain Richardson, who had just pulled up in an unmarked car. Wilson's stomach dropped as he watched his superior officer exit his vehicle, fury evident in every step. The woman smiled slightly, though there was no joy in it. "Hello, honey," she said to the captain, "I was just about to call you." The color drained from Wilson's face as realization dawned, he'd just attempted to arrest Christine Richardson, the captain's wife and the recently appointed district attorney. The autumn breeze picked up again, scattering leaves across the parking lot as Wilson's world began to crumble around him. His actions, born from years of unchecked biases and assumptions, were about to face their reckoning. The bodycam footage he'd forgotten about was still recording, capturing every moment of his unwarranted escalation. Christine Richardson straightened her blazer, her dignity intact despite the humiliation she'd just endured. "I think," she said, looking directly at Wilson, "we need to have a serious conversation about police conduct in this department." Her words carried the weight of both personal experience and professional authority. The gathering crowd of onlookers had their phones out, recording what would soon become a viral moment of justice served. But for Christine, this wasn't about viral fame or revenge, it was about systemic change, and she now had irrefutable evidence of the very behavior she'd been fighting against in her career. Captain Richardson stood between his wife and Officer Wilson, his face a mask of controlled rage. The incident would spark a departmental investigation that would uncover a pattern of similar behavior, leading to a complete overhaul of training procedures and accountability measures. Sometimes, change comes from the most unexpected encounters, even on quiet suburban streets where prejudice hides behind badges and authority. The next morning, the Cedar Grove Police Department buzzed with tension. Officer Wilson sat in the Internal Affairs office, his uniform feeling unusually tight around his neck as he watched the bodycam footage play on the screen before him. Each second that ticked by revealed his actions in stark, unforgiving detail. The Internal Affairs investigator, Lieutenant Chen, paused the video at crucial moments, her expression remaining neutral as she took detailed notes. "Walk me through your thought process here," Lieutenant Chen said, rewinding to the moment Wilson had demanded Christine step out of her vehicle. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, making the silence between questions feel even more oppressive. Outside the office, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Cell phone footage of the incident had spread across social media platforms, gaining millions of views overnight. Local news vans lined the street in front of the police station, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Captain Richardson sat in his office, blinds drawn, reviewing Officer Wilson's personnel file. 15 years of service, 12 civilian complaints, all dismissed or marked inconclusive. The pattern was clear now, but hindsight carried the bitter taste of responsibility. As a leader, he had failed to see what was happening under his own command. Christine Richardson's office at the district attorney's building was equally busy, but for different reasons. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, civil rights attorneys, media outlets, and community leaders all wanting to hear her story. But Christine had bigger plans than just sharing her experience. "We need to turn this into meaningful change," she told her assistant, spreading documents across her desk. "Get me everything we have on similar incidents from the past 5 years. And contact the police academy director, we need to discuss their training protocols." Back at the station, Officer Wilson's partner, Detective Rodriguez, watched the growing media circus from the break room. The coffee in his cup had gone cold hours ago as he wrestled with his conscience. He'd seen Wilson's behavioral patterns before but had always looked the other way. Now, that silence felt like complicity. The mayor's office called an emergency meeting, gathering the police chief, community leaders, and civil rights advocates around a large oak table. The air conditioning hummed as they discussed the incident, its implications, and the necessary steps forward. Christine sat at the table not just as a victim, but as a force for change. "This isn't about one officer or one incident," she addressed the room, her voice carrying the weight of both personal experience and professional authority. "This is about a system that allows these incidents to occur and then buries them in paperwork and procedure." Meanwhile, in the community, the incident had sparked intense discussions. At the local coffee shop, residents debated police reform while watching news coverage on the wall-mounted TV. The barista, who had witnessed similar incidents before, finally felt bold enough to share her own stories. Officer Wilson's home life was unraveling. His wife sat at their kitchen table, reading social media comments about her husband while their teenage daughter locked herself in her room, embarrassed to face her friends at school. The weight of his actions had created ripples that touched every aspect of his life. Back at the station, Lieutenant Chen's investigation uncovered more troubling patterns. Cross-referencing Wilson's traffic stops with demographic data painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. The numbers told a story of systematic bias that had gone unchecked for years. Christine used her lunch break to meet with community organizers at a local restaurant. The meeting wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was about transformation. They discussed police training reforms, accountability measures, and community oversight programs that could prevent similar incidents in the future. "We have a unique opportunity here," Christine explained, her salad untouched as she shared her vision. "We can use this incident as a catalyst for real change, not just in our department but as a model for others." Captain Richardson found himself in the unusual position of balancing his roles as department leader and husband. The incident had exposed blind spots in his leadership, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about the culture he had helped maintain through inaction. As evening approached, Wilson sat alone in his car in the station parking lot, staring at his badge. The weight of his actions, stripped of justification by the clear light of scrutiny, finally began to sink in. His phone buzzed with a message: mandatory sensitivity training would begin tomorrow, but he knew no training could undo the damage his actions had caused. The day ended with a community town hall meeting, hastily organized but well attended. The gymnasium of Cedar Grove High School filled with concerned citizens, each bringing their own experiences and perspectives to the conversation. Christine and Captain Richardson sat side by side at the panel table, their personal and professional lives now irrevocably intertwined with the cause of police reform. As Christine stepped up to the microphone, the crowd hushed. Her experience had given her a platform, and she intended to use it wisely. "What happened to me was not unique," she began, her voice steady. "What is unique is that I am in a position to do something about it. And I promise you, this is just the beginning of real change in Cedar Grove." The setting sun cast long shadows through the gymnasium windows as the community began the long process of healing and reform. One incident had pulled back the curtain on years of systemic issues, but it had also created an opportunity for transformation. As the meeting continued into the night, the foundations of change were being laid, one difficult conversation at a time. A week after the incident, Cedar Grove felt different. The morning sun illuminated new protest signs on front lawns, and community bulletin boards were covered with flyers announcing police reform meetings. The small town had become the epicenter of a national conversation about law enforcement and racial bias. Officer Wilson sat in the back row of the mandatory sensitivity training session, watching a diversity consultant explain implicit bias through PowerPoint slides. Around him, other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some saw the training as punishment for Wilson's actions, others were beginning to recognize their own biases reflected in the presentation. "It's not about blame," the consultant explained, clicking to a new slide. "It's about awareness and change." Wilson found himself taking notes for the first time, the weight of his actions having stripped away years of defensive attitudes. His phone sat silent in his pocket. He'd deleted his social media accounts days ago after his daughter showed him the viral memes featuring his face. Meanwhile, Christine Richardson had transformed her personal experience into a catalyst for change. She sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of police reform proposals from across the country. Her assistant brought in another coffee as Christine highlighted passages in a thick document about community oversight boards. "We're not just changing policies," she told the local news reporter who'd come for an exclusive interview. "We're changing culture." The reporter's pen scratched across her notepad, capturing Christine's words as the interview delved into specific reforms being proposed. At the police station, Captain Richardson implemented immediate changes. Every traffic stop now required officers to call in their reason for pulling someone over before approaching the vehicle. Body cameras had to be activated the moment lights were turned on, not just during the interaction. Small steps, but meaningful ones. The captain's personal life had become intertwined with his professional reforms. Over dinner at home, Christine shared stories from her years as a lawyer, incidents she'd never told him before. "I didn't want to put you in a difficult position," she admitted, pushing food around her plate. "But silence hasn't served anyone well." Detective Rodriguez had become an unexpected ally in the reform process. His knowledge of department dynamics and years of observed behaviors proved invaluable. In a private meeting with Internal Affairs, he finally spoke about the patterns he'd witnessed, his testimony adding weight to the case for systematic changes. "The thing is," Rodriguez explained to Lieutenant Chen, "we all saw it happening. We just convinced ourselves it wasn't our problem to solve." The lieutenant's office had become a confessional of sorts, where officers felt safe admitting their past complacency. The local high school turned the incident into a teaching moment. In civics classes, students discussed civil rights and law enforcement responsibility. Wilson's daughter, though still attending a different school, found her own voice in the conversation, starting a student group focused on community police relations. Christine's influence extended beyond Cedar Grove. Police departments from neighboring counties reached out, wanting to get ahead of similar incidents. She began developing a comprehensive training program that would become a model for departments nationwide. Prevention is better than reaction, she explained during a regional police chiefs meeting. The presentation screen behind her showed statistics, but she kept the focus on human stories, including her own. The chiefs listened with unprecedented attention, aware that their departments could easily face similar scrutiny. Officer Wilson's transformation continued, though not without struggles. During his temporary desk assignment, he began reviewing his own past traffic stops, seeing them through new eyes. The patterns in his behavior became painfully clear. During his mandatory counseling sessions, he finally spoke about the fears and prejudices that had driven his actions. "I never thought of myself as biased," he told his therapist, staring out the window at the police parking lot below. "I just thought I was being a good cop." The therapist nodded, letting the weight of his realization hang in the air. The community's response evolved as well. Initial anger gave way to determined activism. Local church groups organized dialogue sessions between residents and police officers. Coffee shops hosted cop and community conversations where officers and citizens could talk in a neutral setting. At one such meeting, an elderly black resident shared stories of driving through Cedar Grove in the 1960s. The room fell silent as he described how little had changed in his lifetime. When he finished speaking, a young officer stood up and promised, "It changes now, sir. It changes with us." Christine's office became a hub for reform activities. She worked late into the evening, drafting proposals and reviewing incident reports. Captain Richardson often joined her, their professional partnership strengthened by their shared mission. Together, they were building a new model of police accountability. The media attention began to shift from sensational headlines to substantive coverage of reform efforts. National news programs featured Cedar Grove as an example of how crisis could lead to meaningful change. Christine's articulate interviews and clear vision for reform made her a sought-after speaker at law enforcement conferences. As the third week after the incident began, Cedar Grove Police Department announced its new oversight committee. The diverse group included community leaders, civil rights attorneys, and retired law enforcement officials. Their first task, reviewing all traffic stop procedures and racial disparity data. Officer Wilson, still on desk duty, volunteered to share his story during new officer training sessions. His first presentation was difficult, standing before fresh-faced recruits, admitting his mistakes. But their attentive faces and thoughtful questions suggested his experience might prevent future incidents. The changes weren't just procedural. The department's break room conversations shifted from complaints about new rules to discussions about community engagement. Officers began sharing their own experiences with bias, creating an atmosphere where accountability wasn't seen as an attack on police, but as a path to better policing. As the sun set on another day of reform work, Christine stood at her office window, watching police cruisers pass on their evening patrols. Each car now carried not just officers, but the weight of heightened scrutiny and the promise of change. Her phone buzzed with another interview request, another department seeking guidance, another step toward transformation. The incident that could have torn Cedar Grove apart was instead pulling it together, creating a template for change that would ripple far beyond its borders. In the end, it wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong, it was about a community choosing to confront its problems and work toward real solutions. 1 month after the incident, Cedar Grove Police Department looked different. The old break room had been converted into a community liaison office, its walls now covered with community event calendars and citizen feedback forms. The change wasn't just cosmetic, it represented a fundamental shift in how the department viewed its relationship with the public. Officer Wilson stood before the newly formed Civilian Oversight Board, his uniform pressed but his shoulders carrying the weight of accountability. This wasn't just another meeting, it was his formal review. The board members, a diverse group of community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights advocates, listened intently as he detailed his journey of the past month. "I can't undo what I did," Wilson admitted, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But I can help make sure it never happens again." He presented his proposal for a peer intervention program, something he'd developed during his suspension. The program would train officers to recognize and stop problematic behavior among their colleagues before it escalated. Across town, Christine Richardson was making waves of her own. She stood in the state capitol building, addressing a committee of legislators about Cedar Grove's emerging reform model. The chamber was packed with police chiefs, union representatives, and civil rights activists from across the state. "What happened in Cedar Grove isn't unique," she explained, her voice echoing through the chamber. "What's unique is how we're responding to it." Behind her, a presentation showed the preliminary results of their reforms, a 40% reduction in use of force incidents and a significant improvement in community satisfaction ratings. Captain Richardson had his own challenges to navigate. The police union initially pushed back against some reforms, seeing them as an attack on officer autonomy. He sat in yet another tense meeting with union representatives, his wife's experience giving him a unique perspective on the necessity of change. "We're not weakening law enforcement," he argued, spreading data sheets across the conference table. "We're strengthening community trust. And that makes our jobs easier and safer." The union leaders exchanged glances, the numbers before them making a compelling case for reform. The changes weren't limited to policy. Officer Rodriguez organized the department's first community basketball game, turning the police station parking lot into a makeshift court. Officers and local teenagers played together, their laughter and friendly trash talk breaking down barriers that had seemed insurmountable weeks before. Wilson's daughter had found her own voice in the movement. She started a blog documenting the changes in Cedar Grove from a teenager's perspective. Her honest posts about watching her father's transformation from just another cop to an advocate for change attracted readers from across the country. "My dad made a mistake," she wrote in one powerful entry. "But his mistake is changing our whole town for the better." The post went viral, adding a personal dimension to the ongoing national conversation about police reform. Christine's office became a hub for innovation. She worked with tech companies to develop new software for tracking police interactions and identifying potential bias patterns. The program would flag concerning behavior before it led to serious incidents, allowing for early intervention and additional training. "Technology isn't the whole solution," she explained to a group of developers, "but it's an important tool for transparency and accountability." The team nodded, their fingers flying over keyboards as they refined algorithms to detect subtle patterns in officer behavior. The local media landscape had evolved as well. Instead of sensational headlines, reporters now focused on the concrete changes taking place. They covered community police meetings, profiled officers who embraced reform, and tracked the implementation of new policies. The Cedar Grove Gazette won a regional award for its nuanced coverage of the transformation. Officer Wilson's therapy sessions continued, but their focus had shifted. "I'm not just working through guilt anymore," he told his therapist. "I'm learning to be a different kind of police officer." His insights into his own biases and behavior patterns became valuable teaching tools for other officers struggling with the changes. The community response continued to evolve. Local businesses started displaying "Community Policing Partner" stickers in their windows, signaling their commitment to the new approach. Coffee shops offered free drinks to officers who stopped in for community chat sessions. The barriers between police and public were slowly dissolving. Christine's influence spread beyond law enforcement. She was invited to speak at law schools, sharing her unique perspective as both a victim of profiling and an architect of reform. Her presentations combined legal expertise with personal experience, making a powerful case for systemic change. "The law is important," she told a packed auditorium of future lawyers, "but so is the human element. We need both to create lasting change." Students lined up afterward to share their own stories and ask about internships with her office. Captain Richardson found himself navigating new territory as well. Other police departments sent officers to study Cedar Grove's reforms, and he often led tours explaining the changes. "We're not perfect," he would tell them, "but we're committed to getting better." The Oversight Committee's work began showing measurable results. Traffic stop data revealed a significant decrease in racial disparities. Complaint resolution times improved dramatically. Officer satisfaction surveys showed increased job satisfaction, despite initial resistance to the changes. Wilson's peer intervention program launched as a pilot project. Officers were trained to recognize signs of bias and escalation, and more importantly, empowered to step in when they saw concerning behavior. The program's success caught the attention of police departments across the state. As the fourth week of reforms drew to a close, Cedar Grove hosted its first town-wide celebration of community police partnership. The park filled with residents and officers sharing meals, playing games, and most importantly, talking openly about their experiences and hopes for the future. Christine watched the celebration from a bench, her legal pad covered with notes for future initiatives. A young officer approached, asking if she would mentor him through law school. She smiled, recognizing that the changes they'd started would continue long after the media attention faded. The sun set on Cedar Grove, casting long shadows across the park where officers and citizens continued their conversations. The incident that had threatened to tear the community apart had instead become a foundation for rebuilding trust, one conversation, one policy, and one changed mind at a time. 2 months had passed since the incident that changed Cedar Grove forever. The police station's lobby, once a sterile, intimidating space, now featured a wall of community photos and success stories. Among them hung a framed picture of Christine Richardson and Officer Wilson speaking together at a police academy graduation, a powerful symbol of transformation that no one could have predicted. The morning began with Cedar Grove hosting its first regional police reform summit. Police chiefs and community leaders from 3 neighboring states filled the community center's main hall. Christine stood at the podium, her presence now carrying the weight of proven success rather than just promised change. "What we've learned," she addressed the crowded room, "is that real change happens in the small moments." Behind her, a slideshow displayed statistics that told a compelling story: civilian complaints down 60%, community engagement up 200%, and officer job satisfaction improved by 45%. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The real change is in the conversations happening in our streets, shops, and homes. Officer Wilson sat in the audience, no longer the department's cautionary tale but one of its strongest advocates for change. His recent promotion to Community Relations Sergeant came with the responsibility of implementing the peer intervention program he developed. The program had already prevented several potential incidents, with officers successfully stepping in to de-escalate situations. "It's about creating a culture where doing the right thing is easier than doing the wrong thing," Wilson explained to a group of visiting officers during a break. His daughter, sitting in the back of the room working on her now nationally recognized blog, smiled proudly as she documented her father's words. Captain Richardson had his own victories to celebrate. The department's new training protocols were being adopted by police academies across the state. He stood before a group of academy instructors, sharing how Cedar Grove had transformed its approach to officer education. "We're not just teaching procedures anymore," he explained, walking them through the new curriculum. "We're teaching empathy, cultural awareness, and the courage to stand up when something's wrong." The instructors leaned forward, taking notes as he described scenario-based training that incorporated real community members as role players. Christine's influence had extended far beyond law enforcement. Law firms across the country sought her guidance on police accountability cases. She balanced her role as district attorney with speaking engagements and consulting work, always bringing the conversation back to practical, implementable changes. In her office, she reviewed a proposal for a national police reform database. Information sharing is crucial, she told her team. We need to track what works and what doesn't across jurisdictions. The project would allow departments to learn from each other's successes and failures, creating a network of accountability and innovation. The community's transformation continued to surprise everyone. Local businesses had created a community safety council, working directly with police to address concerns before they became problems. The owner of a popular coffee shop described how officers now knew regular customers by name, creating natural opportunities for informal community policing. Officer Rodriguez's community basketball games had evolved into a full-fledged youth mentorship program. Every weekend, the police station parking lot filled with young people not running from the police, but running alongside them in friendly competition. The program had become so successful that other departments sent officers to learn how to replicate it. Wilson's therapy sessions had become group discussions, with other officers joining to share their experiences and challenges. We're unlearning decades of ingrained behavior, the therapist observed during one session. But more importantly, we're learning new ways to serve and protect that don't compromise our humanity or our community's trust. The Civilian Oversight Board had grown into a model of collaborative governance. Their weekly meetings now included representatives from other cities studying their approach. Christine often attended, not as the catalyst for its creation, but as one voice among many working toward continued improvement. The key is sustained engagement, she explained to a visiting delegation. Reform isn't a destination, it's a journey that requires constant attention and adjustment. The board's latest initiative focused on creating opportunities for officers to live in the communities they served, breaking down the us versus them mentality that had contributed to past problems. Captain Richardson found himself navigating new challenges as the department's success drew national attention. News crews regularly visited Cedar Grove, hoping to understand how a single incident had sparked such comprehensive change. It wasn't just the incident, he would tell them. It was our community's decision to use that moment as a catalyst for transformation. The department's physical space continued to evolve. The old shooting range had been partially converted into a community meeting space, with officers and residents regularly gathering for lunch and learn sessions. The walls featured artwork from local schools, humanizing the space and reminding officers of the community they served. Wilson's peer intervention program had its first major test when a veteran officer was reported by colleagues for concerning behavior patterns. Instead of defensiveness or denial, the department's new culture allowed for open discussion and constructive intervention. The officer received counseling and additional training, preventing what could have become another incident. Christine's work began attracting attention from police unions nationwide. Initially skeptical, union leaders saw how Cedar Grove's reforms had actually improved officer safety and job satisfaction. She worked with them to develop guidelines for implementing changes without compromising officer protection. Reform isn't anti-police, she told a gathering of union representatives. It's pro-community, and that includes the officers who serve it. Her words resonated with those who had long seen reform as a threat rather than an opportunity for improvement. The local high school's curriculum now included a community leadership course, co-taught by police officers and civil rights advocates. Students learned about law enforcement, civil rights, and the importance of active citizenship. Wilson's daughter often spoke to classes, sharing her perspective on how personal transformation could lead to systemic change. As the sun set on another busy day in Cedar Grove, Christine and Captain Richardson sat in their backyard, reflecting on the journey. The incident that had nearly ended his career and could have torn their marriage apart had instead strengthened both. Their shared commitment to reform had created ripples that continued to spread far beyond their small town. Sometimes, Christine mused, watching the evening patrol car drive past their house, the worst moments lead to the best changes. The officer in the patrol car waved as he passed, a small gesture that would have seemed impossible just months ago. In Cedar Grove, such moments were no longer exceptions but expectations, proof that real change was possible when a community decided to transform crisis into opportunity. 3 months after the incident, Cedar Grove found itself at the center of a national conversation about police reform. The small town's transformation had caught the attention of major news networks, and a documentary crew followed Christine Richardson through her daily routine, capturing the real-world impact of the changes she'd helped implement. The morning began with Christine preparing for her biggest challenge yet, testifying before a congressional committee on law enforcement reform. As she reviewed her notes in her home office, she reflected on how a moment of personal humiliation had evolved into a movement for positive change. "You ready for this?" Captain Richardson asked, bringing her a cup of coffee. The smell of breakfast wafting from the kitchen reminded them both of simpler times, before their lives had become intertwined with a national movement. Christine smiled, adjusting her suit jacket. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, scanning the testimony she'd prepared. Who would have thought that traffic stop would lead to this? The captain squeezed her shoulder, both of them understanding the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, Officer Wilson, now Sergeant Wilson, was conducting a training session for visiting officers from across the country. The department's peer intervention program had gained national recognition, and departments from major cities were sending representatives to learn from Cedar Grove's experience. "The hardest part isn't learning to recognize problems," Wilson explained to the gathered officers. "It's finding the courage to speak up when you see them." His words carried the authority of someone who had lived through both sides of the issue. The visiting officers leaned forward, many of them taking notes on tablets and phones. The police station had become a model of community-oriented policing. The walls displayed artwork from local schools alongside professional photographs documenting the department's transformation. A new digital dashboard in the lobby showed real-time statistics about police interactions, response times, and community feedback, complete transparency in action. Detective Rodriguez had just returned from a speaking engagement at a National Police Chiefs Conference. His presentation on community engagement had drawn standing-room-only crowds. "The key," he told his colleagues during the morning briefing, "is that we're not just talking about change anymore. We're living it." The Civilian Oversight Board had expanded its scope, now serving as consultants for other cities implementing similar programs. Their weekly meetings were live-streamed, attracting viewers from across the country who wanted to understand how effective civilian oversight could work in practice. "Transparency isn't just about sharing information," one board member explained during a virtual workshop. "It's about creating systems where problems can't hide in the shadows." The chat feed filled with questions from other communities eager to implement similar measures. Christine's congressional testimony was broadcast live on national news networks. She spoke not just as a victim of profiling, but as an architect of successful reform. The chamber fell silent as she shared Cedar Grove's story, backing up personal experiences with hard data about the effectiveness of their changes. "What happened to me was a symptom of a larger problem," she testified, her voice steady. "But Cedar Grove's response shows us a path forward. We've proven that meaningful reform is possible when communities and law enforcement work together toward common goals." Back in Cedar Grove, Wilson's daughter had become an unexpected voice for the next generation. Her blog had evolved into a popular podcast about police reform from a young person's perspective. She interviewed officers, community members, and other teenagers, creating a bridge between law enforcement and youth culture. The department's physical transformation continued. The old interrogation rooms had been renovated into conversation spaces, with comfortable furniture and calming colors. Officers reported that the less confrontational environment led to more productive interviews and better outcomes. "It's amazing how changing the space changes the dynamic," one officer commented during a tour for visiting officials. "People feel more comfortable telling us what really happened when they don't feel like they're in an episode of Law and Order." Christine's work caught the attention of civil rights organizations nationwide. She balanced her local responsibilities with speaking engagements, always emphasizing the practical aspects of reform over political rhetoric. Her approach resonated with both law enforcement and activist communities, creating unexpected alliances. The Cedar Grove model began appearing in police academy textbooks. Captain Richardson contributed a chapter about their experience, focusing on the importance of leadership in creating cultural change. Reform isn't just about new policies, he wrote. It's about creating an environment where doing the right thing becomes second nature. Wilson's peer intervention program faced its biggest test, and a group of officers reported concerns about a senior lieutenant's behavior. The department's new protocols allowed for a professional intervention that preserved both accountability and dignity. The incident, and its successful resolution, became a case study in effective departmental self-regulation. The community's transformation extended beyond policing. Local businesses reported increased customer traffic as Cedar Grove's reputation for safety and community policing drew visitors from neighboring towns. The Chamber of Commerce created a Community First certification program, recognizing businesses that actively participated in community police partnership initiatives. Christine's office launched a nationwide database of police reform initiatives, creating a clearinghouse for departments to share successful programs and learn from each other's experiences. The project quickly became a valuable resource for communities starting their own reform efforts. "We're not just changing policies," she explained during a webinar. For police chiefs, "We're creating a new normal where accountability and community trust are built into every aspect of law enforcement." As evening approached, Cedar Grove hosted a graduation ceremony for the first class of officers trained under the new protocols. The community center was packed with residents, officers, and media representatives. Christine and Captain Richardson sat in the front row, watching as Wilson delivered the keynote address. "When I stood before you 3 months ago," Wilson began, his voice carrying emotion, "I was a symbol of what needed to change. Today, I stand before you as proof that change is possible." The graduates, representing departments from across the state, nodded in understanding. The ceremony concluded with a community dinner where new officers and residents shared meals and conversations. The atmosphere was celebratory but purposeful. Everyone understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. As the night wound down, Christine found a quiet moment to reflect. The congressional testimony had gone well, but she knew the real work happened in these small moments of connection and understanding. Her phone buzzed with messages from other communities seeking guidance, each one a reminder that Cedar Grove's story was just the beginning. The evening patrol shift changed, and a new group of officers headed out into the community. They carried with them not just badges and protocols, but a new understanding of their role in creating and maintaining community trust. Cedar Grove's transformation had become a blueprint for change, proving that even the most difficult moments could lead to meaningful progress. For months after the incident, Cedar Grove's transformation had attracted international attention. Christine Richardson stood in her office, watching a live video feed from a police conference in London where her reform model was being presented as a case study in effective community policing. The small town's story had transcended borders, becoming a beacon of hope for communities worldwide. The morning sun streamed through her window as she prepared for a virtual meeting with police officials from 3 different continents. On her desk lay translations of the Cedar Grove protocols in 5 languages, each adapted to respect local cultural contexts while maintaining the core principles of accountability and community trust. "I never imagined we'd be here," she admitted to Captain Richardson, who was reviewing requests from international police departments wanting to send officers for training. "A traffic stop in Cedar Grove is changing how people think about policing across the world." Sergeant Wilson had become an unexpected ambassador for police reform. Today, he was conducting a virtual training session for officers from Australia, Canada, and South Africa. His personal journey from being part of the problem to leading solutions resonated across cultural and national boundaries. "Change isn't about where you're from," he told the international audience. It's about recognizing that we all share the same basic human needs for safety, respect, and understanding. The officers on screen nodded, some taking notes, others sharing similar experiences from their own communities. The police station had evolved into a global learning center. A new wing, funded by an International Police Reform Foundation, housed state-of-the-art training facilities. Interactive displays showed real-time connections with partner departments worldwide, each implementing variations of the Cedar Grove model. Detective Rodriguez led a tour group of visiting officials from Europe, explaining how the department's physical transformation reflected deeper cultural changes. "These walls used to separate us from the community," he said, gesturing to the glass-walled community meeting spaces that had replaced solid barriers. "Now they bring us together." The Civilian Oversight Board had become a model studied by governments worldwide. Today, they hosted observers from democratic nations looking to strengthen police accountability in their own communities. The board's weekly meetings now included simultaneous translation in multiple languages. "Trust is a universal language," Board Chairman Lee explained to the international visitors. "When people see that their voices matter, that change is possible, it creates a ripple effect that crosses all boundaries." The observers took photos of the board's transparent reporting systems and community feedback mechanisms. Wilson's daughter had taken her advocacy international. Her blog and podcast now featured young voices from around the world sharing their experiences with police reform. She hosted a weekly video chat with youth activists from different countries, creating a global network of next-generation leaders. "Dad," she said during breakfast, scrolling through messages on her tablet, "a student group in New Zealand wants to start their own police youth dialogue program based on what we're doing here." Wilson smiled, remembering how far they'd both come from the day that could have destroyed their family. Christine's congressional testimony had caught the attention of the United Nations. She received an invitation to address an international symposium on law enforcement and human rights. As she prepared her speech, she reflected on how personal humiliation had transformed into global impact. The department's peer intervention program had been adapted for use in different cultural contexts. Wilson worked with international consultants to ensure the training materials respected local customs while maintaining the core principle of officer accountability. "The specifics might change," he explained during a virtual workshop with Asian police officials, "but the fundamental need for officers to help each other do the right thing is universal." The officials shared their own experiences, creating a rich dialogue about cultural adaptation of reform principles. Cedar Grove's community engagement programs had sparked similar initiatives worldwide. The police station's community basketball games had inspired departments from Brazil to Japan to create their own sports-based outreach programs. Photos of these international adaptations lined the station's halls, showing how a simple idea could cross cultural boundaries. Christine's database of police reform initiatives had gone global. Departments worldwide contributed their experiences, creating a rich repository of knowledge about what worked and what didn't in different cultural contexts. The platform included translation features and cultural notes to make the information accessible to all. "We're building a global community of practice," she explained during an international webinar. "Every success story, every lesson learned, becomes part of a shared knowledge base that helps other departments avoid mistakes and implement effective reforms." The local high school's community leadership course had attracted international attention. Education officials from other countries visited to observe how the program bridged gaps between youth and law enforcement. The curriculum was being translated and adapted for use in schools worldwide. Captain Richardson found himself mentoring police leaders from developing nations, sharing lessons learned from Cedar Grove's transformation. "The challenges might look different in different places," he told them, "but the principles of trust, accountability, and community engagement are universal." Wilson's original traffic stop had become a case study in police academies worldwide. But instead of focusing on what went wrong, the study emphasized how a crisis could become a catalyst for positive change. His willingness to acknowledge his mistakes and work for reform had become an example of personal and professional transformation. The community's transformation continued to evolve. Local businesses developed an international sister city program, connecting with communities worldwide that were implementing similar reform initiatives. Video screens in shop windows showed live feeds from partner cities, creating a sense of global connection. As evening fell, Christine prepared for a late-night video conference with police officials in Asia. The time differences were challenging, but the opportunity to share Cedar Grove's experience made it worthwhile. On her screen, faces from across the Pacific waited eagerly to learn from their small town's big changes. The most important thing we've learned, she told them, is that change is possible anywhere people are willing to work for it. What happened in Cedar Grove isn't just our story anymore, it's becoming part of a global movement for better policing. The night shift began, and officers headed out into the community wearing body cameras that had been improved based on feedback from departments worldwide. They carried with them not just the responsibility of protecting Cedar Grove, but the knowledge that their actions could influence police reform globally. As Christine finally headed home, she passed the spot where she'd been pulled over 4 months ago. The place that had once represented humiliation and injustice had become ground zero for a worldwide movement toward better policing. Sometimes, she reflected, the biggest changes start in the smallest places. 6 months after the incident that changed everything, Cedar Grove hosted an international police reform conference. The community center buzzed with energy as delegates from 6 continents gathered to celebrate what had become known as the Cedar Grove model. Christine Richardson stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of faces that represented the future of law enforcement worldwide. 6 months ago, I was pulled over on a quiet street just 3 blocks from here, she began, her voice carrying the weight of experience and the hope of transformation. Today, that street has become a symbol of change that none of us could have imagined. In the audience, Sergeant Wilson nodded, no longer bearing the shame of that day but carrying the pride of being part of the solution. The conference wasn't just about celebrating success, it was about ensuring the sustainability of reform. Working groups focused on adapting Cedar Grove's programs for different cultural contexts, while maintaining the core principles that had made them effective: transparency, accountability, and community engagement. Captain Richardson led a panel discussion on leadership in times of crisis. The easiest thing would have been to treat this as a single incident, discipline one officer, and move on, he explained to the gathered police chiefs. Instead, we chose to see it as an opportunity for complete transformation. That made all the difference. The police station had become a living laboratory of reform. International observers watched as officers demonstrated the latest version of the peer intervention program, now enhanced with virtual reality scenarios and real-time feedback systems. The technology was impressive, but everyone understood that the real change happened in human hearts and minds. Wilson's daughter took the stage to present findings from her global youth survey. Her research, conducted through her now international network of young activists, revealed how the next generation viewed police reform. "We don't just want to inherit a better system," she declared. "We want to be part of creating it." Christine's office had become a global resource center for police reform. The walls displayed a digital map showing real-time updates from partner departments worldwide. Each point of light represented a community implementing their own version of the Cedar Grove model, creating a constellation of change. "What we've built here isn't just a program or a policy," Christine explained to a group of international journalists. "It's a new way of thinking about the relationship between law enforcement and community. And that transcends borders, languages, and cultures." The Civilian Oversight Board hosted a special session demonstrating their evolved approach to community participation. Representatives from democratic nations watched as citizens and officers engaged in constructive dialogue about recent incidents, showing how transparency and accountability could build trust rather than create division. Detective Rodriguez, now head of international outreach, led workshops on cultural adaptation of reform principles. The details might change, he explained, but the fundamental need for trust between police and community remains constant. Officers from different countries shared their experiences, creating a rich tapestry of perspectives on reform. Wilson's peer intervention program had evolved into a comprehensive system for cultural change within police departments. Officers who had initially resisted the changes now taught others how to overcome their own resistance. The program's success rates spoke for themselves. Incidents of bias-based policing had dropped dramatically wherever it was implemented. The community's transformation was evident everywhere. Local businesses displayed flags from partner cities worldwide, and the high school hosted regular video conferences with students from other countries studying the Cedar Grove model. The town had become a living example of how crisis could lead to positive change. Christine and Captain Richardson found a quiet moment during the conference to visit the spot where everything began. The street looked the same, but everything about policing in Cedar Grove had changed. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there that day," Christine mused. "Change was coming," the captain replied. "We just needed something to wake us up to the need for it." They watched as a patrol car drove by, its officer waving to children playing in a nearby yard, a simple gesture that represented years of work rebuilding community trust. The conference's final day featured a ceremony honoring the first graduating class of the International Police Reform Academy, housed in Cedar Grove's expanded training facility. Officers from 20 countries received certificates, but more importantly, they carried with them the tools and mindset needed to implement real change in their own communities. Wilson delivered the graduation address, his words translated simultaneously for the international audience. "6 months ago, I was the problem," he acknowledged. "Today, I stand before you as proof that change is possible, not just in policies and procedures, but in hearts and minds." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new monument in front of the police station, a glass sculpture showing intertwined hands of different colors, representing the partnership between police and community. The inscription read in multiple languages, "Change begins with understanding." As the conference drew to a close, Christine prepared for her final address. The past 6 months had transformed not just Cedar Grove, but the very concept of what was possible in police reform. Her phone buzzed with messages from departments worldwide, each sharing their own stories of transformation inspired by Cedar Grove's example. "We stand here today not at the end of a journey, but at the beginning of a new chapter," she told the gathered delegates. What happened in Cedar Grove was a catalyst, but what happens next depends on all of us. The tools for change are now in your hands. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors as the international delegates departed, each carrying with them pieces of Cedar Grove's story. The small town had become more than a model for police reform, it had become proof that positive change was possible anywhere people were willing to work for it. Wilson watched the last of the conference attendees leave, standing beside his daughter who was already planning her next International Youth Leadership Summit. "Did you ever think that traffic stop would lead to all this?" she asked. "No," he smiled, "but I'm grateful it did. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth." They walked together toward the community center, where local residents were gathering for their regular evening meeting with officers, a simple tradition that had become a cornerstone of their transformed community. As night fell on Cedar Grove, the police station's new digital dashboard displayed updates from partner departments around the world. Each notification represented another community beginning its own journey of transformation, inspired by a small town that had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for lasting change. Christine's final task of the day was reviewing requests from more departments wanting to implement the Cedar Grove model. As she read through the messages, she realized that their story had become something larger than any of them had imagined, a blueprint for change that would continue to evolve and grow long after that fateful traffic stop had faded into history.